Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to this talk organized by the Meshon Center for International Security Studies under the thematic and programming cluster of centering the global periphery, in which we are trying to bring speakers who are going to help us think how the global order looks differently if you ask questions from more marginal places in the world rather than the usual actors of grand strategy out there. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for today. First, quickly, for those who don't know me, my name is Theodora Dragostinova, and I'm a professor of Eastern European history. And the speaker for today is Professor Tara Zahra from University of Chicago, who is going to talk to us about her most recent book. I'm sure we're going to see the cover of the book at some point, maybe no. I have it here. I can show it to you. Here it is. Against the World, Anti-Globalism and Mass Politics Between the World Wars. And I just learned today that actually this is the first book talk she's giving to academic audiences. So OSU is very happy to have her here for that. Just a quick introduction. Tara Zahra is Homer J. Livingston Professor of East European History and Roman Family Faculty Director of the Neubauer Collegium at the University of Chicago. She received her PhD in history at the University of Michigan. Nothing is exploding, okay, and has been at Chicago since 2007. Her first book, Kidnapped Souls, National Indifference and the Battle for Children in the Bohemian Lands, 1900 to 1948, was published with Cornell University Press in 2008. And that book, as well as an influential article she published in Slavic Review, helped establish the theoretical category of national indifference as an important framework of analysis in studies of nationalism. And that is something that has continued being debated in scholarship on modern Europe and other fields up until today. And among other prizes, that book also won the Laura Shannon Prize of the Nanovich Institute at Notre Dame University for Best Book in Contemporary European History. Then she authored The Lost Children, Reconstructing Europe's Families After World War II, published by Harvard University Press 3 years later. That book took a transnational approach to the place of children in the rebuilding of post-war Europe, exploring international organizations and humanitarianism, rival ideas of human rights, and evolving notions of child psychology and education in comparative European perspective. That book won the George Louis Beer Prize of the American Historical Association. She then published The Great Departure, Mass Migration from Eastern Europe and the Making of the Free World with Norton, 2016. And I believe she gave a keynote address at the Midwest Slavic Conference here at OSU talking about that book. And in the meantime, she became a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and received a MacArthur Fellowship, otherwise known as a MacArthur Genius Award. And she has held many other prestigious awards. Most recently, she received a Simon Guggenheim Fellowship to complete her current book, Against the World, which was published in January 2023, has been reviewed by the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. And we get to hear about this book today by Professor Tara Zahra herself. So please welcome, join me in welcoming her to OSU.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Theodora. It's really a pleasure to be here. As she said, this is actually my first talk about this book at all since I've published it. And I'm really happy that I get to share my ideas with you and looking forward to our discussion. Let me make sure I understand what's going on here. Oh, look, there is the cover. Excellent. Okay. So I'm going to start my story, as I do in the book, with an interesting figure who I'd love to tell you more about in the Q&A, named Rosica Schwimmer. She was at the height of her powers in 1913 when she invited the entire world to Budapest as the host of the annual meeting of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance. It wasn't really the whole world who showed up, but 240 delegates from 22 countries did attend, making the Congress the largest in the Alliance's history. The mood there was very celebratory. Delegates believed that victory for their cause, the cause of female suffrage, was imminent. In the past year, suffrage bills had been brought before 17 national parliaments, as well as the legislatures of 29 U.S. states. Above all, the delegates in Budapest celebrated their own internationalism. Internationalism had a very specific meaning to these feminists. They intended to enlighten and embolden women in every corner of the globe. But the delegates themselves came exclusively from Europe and North America. It was a disappointment to all that no Asiatic delegate came to Budapest. Asiatic women are unaccustomed to travel alone, organizers lamented. The only country outside of Europe and North America that did send a delegate to Budapest was South Africa. American delegate Carrie Chapman Catt nonetheless speculated that in the winter of 1913, when perpetual darkness shrouded the land of the midnight sun, women wrapped in furs above the polar circle might have been seen gliding our snow-covered roads in sleds drawn by reindeer on their way to suffrage meetings. At the same moment, other women in the midsummer heat of the southern hemisphere, protected by fans and umbrellas, were doing the same thing under the fierce rays of a tropical sun. Soon, Catt speculated, the only remaining frontier for women's rights would lie in outer space. Like Alexander the Great, we shall soon be looking for other worlds to conquer. Most of these women would, here's a picture of Rosica Schwimmer, would receive the vote in their lifetime, including Schwimmer, who was a Hungarian feminist, pacifist, internationalist. She was Jewish also. But it was not because they successfully spread the doctrines of internationalism, feminism, and pacifism around the world and onto outer space. Suffrage was instead the reward they received for their blood sacrifices during the First World War. In 1915, Rosica Schwimmer herself would travel to the United States and embark on a mission with Henry Ford to charter a peace ship. The ship sailed from Hoboken to Europe, where pacifists on board, including Schwimmer, planned to convince Europe's leaders to end the slaughter by Christmas. But the mission was ridiculed from the start. Schwimmer was accused of being a German spy, and Ford eventually snuck off the ship in the middle of the night and went home. Another cartoon from the time kind of mocking this expedition. According to Schwimmer's British colleague, Mary Sheepshanks, the era of globalism itself was over. In 1916, she insisted that even committed internationalists have, quote, lost faith and joined in the chorus of those who never sympathize with our ideals and say internationalism has failed. Although she was confident that the spirit of internationalism would return once, quote, the fumes cleared from men's heads, it had been replaced for the moment by race hatred and national jealousy, leading to tariffs, militarism, armaments, crushing taxation, restricted intercourse, mutual butchery, and the ruin of all progress, end quote. But the fumes did not clear quickly. More than 25 years later, the Austrian Jewish writer Stefan Ziegel would publish his memoir, The World of Yesterday. It was a nostalgic eulogy not only for the now defunct Habsburg Empire, but also for a lost era of globalism. Zweig, a self-described citizen of the world, recalled, quote, before 1914, the earth had belonged to all. There were no permits, no visas, and it always gives me a pleasure to astonish the young by telling them that before 1914, I traveled from Europe to India and to America without a passport and without ever having seen one. After the war, everything changed. The world was on the defensive against strangers. The humiliations which once had been devised with criminals in mind were now imposed upon the traveler before and during every journey. He linked these bureaucratic humiliations to a loss of human dignity and the lost dream of a united world. In Britain, John Maynard Keynes, the economist, penned his own famous obituary for globalization shortly after the war ended in 1919. What an extraordinary episode in the economic progress of man that age was, which came to an end in August 1914, he wrote. In this golden age before the war, quote, the inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth, in such quantities he might see fit, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep, though not in a roving robot, which I was shocked to discover today. It really blew my mind. It was an age in which the projects of militarism and imperialism, of racial and cultural rivalries, monopolies, restrictions, and exclusion, which were to pay serpent to this paradise, were little more than the amusements of his daily newspaper. These looming threats appeared to exercise almost no influence at all on the ordinary course of his social and economic life, the internationalization of which was nearly complete in practice. Stefan Zweig and John Maynard Keynes remain among the most famous analysts of the changes brought by the First World War. Both of them understood these changes in terms of the end of a golden era of globalization, during which people, goods, and capital breezed across international frontiers. But their very nostalgia for a lost world of globalism offers an important clue as to the causes of its downfall. Both men were myopic about the extent to which the freedoms they associated with globalization were actually privileges of a narrow elite. The earth had not belonged to everyone before 1914. It had, however, belonged to people like Keynes and Zweig, and to a lesser extent, Rosica Schwimmer. Zweig and Keynes traveled the world unmolested by bureaucrats before World War I, largely because they were wealthy, highly educated white European men. They traveled freely for business and pleasure with no concern for their physical safety, nor did they worry about the meddlesome interference of husbands, fathers, or state authorities. In steerage, the world of yesterday looked very different. Migrants headed toward the United States around 1900 were already subjected to the poking and prodding of doctors charged with excluding sick, disabled, and undesirable migrants. Non-whites were categorically excluded. Millions of people in the world lived in deep poverty in regions that were denied political sovereignty and exploited economically for the benefit of Europeans and North Americans. While international trade may have benefited all parties in the aggregate, it exacerbated inequality between rich and poor countries. Likewise, within industrialized countries, globalization did not benefit everyone equally. There were clear winners and losers. Keynes frankly acknowledged all of this in 1919. The bounty of globalization was not shared equally, but inequality, he claimed, had been seen as a necessary corollary to progress in the 19th century. Quote, the greater part of the population, it is true, worked hard and lived at a low standard of comfort, yet were, to all appearances, reasonably contented with this lot. This was because they believed in the prospect of social mobility. Escape was possible, he insisted, for any man of capacity or character at all exceeding the average. The First World War shattered those illusions. The magnitude of wartime sacrifice bred popular demands for immediate justice. Across Europe and the world, workers, women, and colonial subjects took to the streets demanding sovereignty and greater equality. The wheels of global integration ground to a halt. This era of anti-globalism lasted another 2 decades, punctuated by the greatest global economic crisis in world history, the Great Depression. Nor would the strife be overcome with a new treaty or a peaceful handshake. Rather, as American journalist Dorothy Thompson would observe from Berlin in 1931, quote, looking at Europe from the British Isles to the Balkans, one is forced to the admission that after 12 years of the League of Nations, the International Court, multilateral treaties, Kellogg Pacts, the International Bank, and disarmament conferences, the whole world is retreating from the international position and is taking its dolls and going home. Why and how did so many people turn against the world after 1918? And what were the consequences of this anti-global turn? My book attempts to answer these questions, exploring the ways in which this reaction against globalization between the 2 world wars drove new forms of politics and transformed daily life across the political spectrum and across broad differences of political form and government. There's no question about the decline of global mobility and trade in this period. In 1914, trade accounted for 30% of the world economy, an all-time high. By 1933, it had slumped to a low of 10% and did not recover until the 1970s. Transatlantic migration, which reached its peak of 2.1 million in 1913, came to a sputtering halt during the war. Global communication also broke down. News that had traveled via telegraph from Europe to North America and Australia in a single day in 1913 took weeks to arrive in 1920. The gold standard, the motor of global financial integration, broke down during the First World War and was abandoned roadside during the 1930s, first by Great Britain, then by the United States, and finally by France and other European powers. While trade migration and international cooperation recovered briefly during the late 1920s, the Great Depression dealt a decisive blow. So what name should we give to this age of disconnection? I use the term anti-globalism to refer to movements that sought to insulate societies from the global economy by mobilizing against policies, people, and institutions that they associated with globalization or internationalism. Sometimes these movements produce deglobalization, the actual slowdown or curtailment of the transnational flow of people, ideas, goods, or capital. But I want to be clear that people at the time did not use the terms globalization or deglobalization. They spoke instead of freedom versus dependence on the global economy, nationalism versus internationalism, sovereignty and its violation. They sought self-sufficiency, economic insulation, and autarky. And here are a couple of engrams that show the term autarky kind of peaking right around 1940 in German, English, and Italian. I therefore use the terms globalization and deglobalization critically and with some caveats. These terms came into widespread use in the 1990s, at a moment when a certain kind of free market capitalism and global integration appeared to be the unstoppable victors of history. Here's globalization. After communism's collapse in Eastern Europe in 1989, many social scientists and journalists began to talk about globalization like they once used to speak of modernization. It seemed to be an irrepressible force that moved in only one direction. McDonald's opened in Moscow, global finance was ascendant, and an innovation called the World Wide Web was bringing people into ever more constant communication. But we only needed to look backward to see forward. The history of Europe between 1918 and 1939 reveals very clearly that the history of globalization has been punctuated by pauses and attempted reversals. Yet many analysts in the 1990s and beyond maintained that globalization was a natural economic process which would accelerate indefinitely if only left unmolested by government intervention. They saw deglobalization, by contrast, including interwar deglobalization, as the product of unnatural political interference with that process. But the history of global integration in the 19th century already reveals that there was absolutely nothing natural or apolitical about it, nor was it directed by an invisible hand. Imperial states and armies guaranteed that their colonies would be hospitable to foreign investments and that debtors would pay back international loans. Even during globalization's most rapid era of acceleration in the late 19th century, free trade was more a British exception than the rule. The United States, for one, maintained very high tariffs right up until the eve of the First World War. Another issue is that globalization and deglobalization might sound like binary opposites. Yet, as we'll see, globalization and deglobalization, like nationalism and internationalism, were often flip sides of the same coin. This simultaneity was nothing new in 1914 or 1918. It was baked into the foundation of internationalist projects and accelerating global connection in the late 19th century. So globalization and anti-globalism rose in tandem. And even between the two world wars, global flows often moved into new channels and morphed into new shapes rather than rising and falling, as we'll see later on in the talk. The most radical anti-globalists rarely sought, let alone achieved, total isolation from the global economy. They sought globalization on their own terms, or at least better terms. And of course, anti-globalists themselves organized in transnational networks, a phenomenon that was noted at the time. The only international which seems to be winning these days is the International of the Anti-Internationalists, quote Dorothy Thompson in 1931. So what did anti-globalism look like between the world wars, and when and why did it begin? While 1914 was a clear breaking point, there were signs of trouble well before the First World War broke out. Anti-globalism was a product of two developments that coincided in the late 19th century. First, the acceleration of globalization itself, and second, the rise of mass politics, which meant that the people negatively affected by global integration, or who felt themselves to be negatively affected, had the ability to talk back, at the ballot box or in the streets. By the turn of the 20th century, it was already clear to many that the gains from free trade, imperial expansion, and mass migration were not shared equally. In Germany, economists began to sound alarm bells about a globalizing food market, arguing that reliance on imports would compromise both the economy and national security. The US began to impose limits on migration in the 1880s with an all-out ban on Chinese migrants in 1882, followed by prohibitions of individuals seen as morally, mentally, or physically deficient. Germany reinforced its borders and ports against the influx of allegedly diseased East European Jews, and countries of mass emigration mobilized to stop what they saw as the massive hemorrhaging of their own human capital. The First World War prompted further skepticism about the risks and rewards of global interdependence. On the one hand, it was certainly a global war. World War I mobilized human and material resources around the world, set soldiers adrift to far-flung locations, and increased international financial entanglement through a massive web of international debt, especially debts to the United States. At the same time, the war produced unprecedented supply chain issues. The cost of shipping tripled and inflation soared. Warring states sought to cut off supplies to their enemies. Most infamously, the Allies blockaded the Central Powers, preventing food and crucial supplies from reaching civilians. The number of Germans and Austrians who starved to death is still debated today by historians, but what is undebatable is that many Central Europeans at the time blamed the blockade for their defeat and vowed that they would never again be dependent on foreign food for their security or survival. Many measures that were introduced during wartime for one purpose continued or became models for anti-global policies and politics after the war. In the name of security, for example, states required travelers to carry passports when they traveled abroad, a new innovation. It was supposed to be temporary, but the requirement was not lifted after the war. Demobilized soldiers took their weapons home. Some, inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution, joined radical internationalist, pacifist, socialist, and communist movements and parties. But the reaction to left-wing forms of globalism, both real and imagined, was immediate and intensely violent. In Budapest and Munich, counter-revolutionary paramilitary groups hunted Jews in the street as anti-Semites linked Jews to global capitalism and international Bolshevism. Rosica Schwimmer was forced to flee Hungary and eventually landed in the United States as a stateless refugee in the 1920s. But there was really no sanctuary there because in the US there was a Red Scare underway and the Ku Klux Klan was on the rise in the North and the Midwest, as well as the South, targeting immigrants and Jews as well as blacks. Prohibition reflected animosity toward Catholic immigrants who were believed to abuse alcohol. The so-called Spanish flu pandemic intensified popular xenophobia as migrants were associated with disease. New laws further restricted mobility. The Johnson-Reed Act, in particular, choked off immigration to the US for decades based on racist quotas. In Europe, meanwhile, states and regions that had once traded freely quickly erected protective barriers against one another. Europe now had 38 economic units instead of 26, 27 different currencies instead of 13, and customs frontiers that extended an additional 6,000 to 7,000 kilometers. Here's the map of Europe before and after the war. After a brief period of recovery and growth in the late 1920s, the Great Depression unsettled the convictions of many former advocates of free trade. John Maynard Keynes famously wrote in 1932, quote, "I sympathize with those who would minimize rather than those who would maximize economic entanglement between nations. Ideas, knowledge, art, hospitality, travel, these are the things which should of their nature be international, but let goods be homespun whenever it is reasonably and conveniently possible, and above all, let finance be primarily national." Anti-global movements were closely linked to the collapse of continental empires and challenges to overseas empires. One of the most obvious parallels to interwar campaigns for autarky in Europe was the Swadeshi Movement in India. The goal was a complete boycott of British goods and the increased production of homespun cloth and clothing. Quote, Our freedom will be won through the spinning wheel, Gandhi declared in 1921. He argued that spinning would protect female virtue, prevent famine, and promote Indian independence. The revival of hand spinning is the least penance we must do for the sin of our forefathers in having succumbed to the satanic influences of the foreign manufacturer. Yet anti-colonial advocates of economic self-sufficiency in interwar India simultaneously preached a self-consciously globalist political agenda. They argued that more economic independence would produce a more genuine form of internationalism based on cooperation rather than exploitation. In Ireland, meanwhile, the conservative government of Eamon de Valera also promoted self-sufficiency in the name of independence from Britain. I have said repeatedly that our guiding principle will be to make Ireland as self-contained and self-supporting as possible, de Valera emphasized. But this would come at the cost of sacrifice, of austerity. If a man makes up his mind to go out into a cottage, he must remember that he cannot have in the cottage the luxuries around him, which he had when he was bearing the kicks of the master. The problem was that even as anti-colonial nationalists demanded an end to empire, many states began to see the expansion and consolidation of empires as their own best route to achieving freedom from the global economy. Britain and France both attempted to rely more on raw materials from their empires during the Great Depression. Empire shopping became a mass movement in Great Britain in the 1920s, encouraging women to purchase, cook, and eat only foods grown in the empire, which often really meant supporting white farmers in places like Canada, Australia, and Kenya. In 1932, the Ottawa Agreement officially established the principle of imperial free trade in Britain, creating a system of preferential tariffs for trade within the empire. Japan, meanwhile, strove to create an anti-colonial autarkic empire in East Asia. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was intended to be a self-sufficient regional bloc that was free of white Western domination, led, of course, by Japan. Nazi geopolitical experts such as Karl Haushofer, meanwhile, saw the Japanese Empire, along with the United States and Russia, as models for what Germany would achieve in Central Europe. Hitler and Mussolini are remembered for their efforts to conquer the world rather than as anti-globalists, but the drive for empire in interwar Italy, Germany, Japan, and elsewhere was often justified precisely in the name of achieving economic self-sufficiency. These were, in some sense, anti-global empires. The revolt against globalization was particularly fierce in states that had either lost their empires at the end of World War I, like Germany and Austria, or felt as though they had lost, like Italy. The Paris peace treaties transformed large sectors of the German, Italian, and Austrian populations into bitter critics of globalization and liberal internationalism. That bitterness was exacerbated by hunger. As I mentioned earlier, during the First World War, Britain had imposed a naval blockade on Germany and Austria-Hungary and continued the blockade after the war to force the losers to accept the terms of the peace treaty. People learned that it was very dangerous to rely on imports for life's necessities. Austria-Hungary had once been the largest free trade zone in Europe. Its dissolution at the end of the war left consumers cut off from producers in successor states that erected high tariffs against one another and in some cases were physically at war with one another. Austrians insisted that their new rump state was not viable. Social Democratic Chancellor Karl Renner declared, "As a consequence of the war, we not only have no free trade, but protective tariffs in every country, direct barriers against foreign goods in every country, and often against foreign people as well." In Vienna, citizens took matters into their own hands. So-called wild settlements appeared around the city before the war ended, as unemployed workers and returning soldiers illegally occupied land, built dwellings out of wood planks, waste material, and dirt, and ate what they could grow. There were at least 70,000 Viennese allotment gardeners at the end of the war, and they organized themselves into a mass movement demanding support from the government. The settlement movement in Austria was explicitly about turning inward rather than outward, colonizing the homeland instead of the rest of the world. Quote, "Inner colonization is pure colonial politics," explained the Austrian Kronenzeitung. The only difference is that it does not involve the colonization of some foreign land, but rather the colonization of our own homeland. Initially, this settlement movement had strong ties to social democracy. In 1920, Otto Neurath, the Vienna Circle philosopher and social democrat, co-founded the Austrian Association for Settlement with Hans Kampfmeyer, a founder of the German Garden City movement. The association employed Adolf Loos and Margareta Schutte-Lehotzky, the first female architect in Austria, to design homes for settlers. Autarkic ideals were fundamental to Loos's vision. One often used to speak of Austrian cuisine, he wrote, only today we have realized that this cuisine was only possible because there was a state form called the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. We have now lost everything that nourished us, and that means re-education. We need to create our own national cuisine, the Bohemian dumpling, the Moravian Buchtel, the Italian schnitzel. All things that were an unshakable part of Viennese cuisine for centuries must now be replaced by local foods. Loos, Neurath, and Schutte-Lehotzky promoted a utopian vision of settlers' lives in modern, healthy, well-planned homes and communities. For example, this is the Frankfurt kitchen on the right, which was famously designed by Schutte-Lehotzky, but she actually designed a prototype for that kitchen in 1922 for a settler's home. In reality, however, the settlement movement, like the broader movement for autarky, required sacrifice of convenience, luxury, and variety for the sake of independence. Max Ermers, a leader of the settlement movement, argued that autarky should be supported by draconian taxes on luxury goods, including alcohol and tobacco, but also on cars, hotels, coffee, tea, and postcards. Another settlement advocate suggested that settlers trade meat and potatoes for a local diet consisting solely of chestnuts, goat's milk, and apples. These projects, not surprisingly, had mixed results. Many settlers were still collecting unemployment payments in the 1930s. Settlers in Leopoldau on the outskirts of Vienna had no schools, doctors, public transit, gas, electricity, sewage, or stores in the 1930s. And settlers interviewed decades later recalled hunger and bone-chilling cold due to a lack of real heating. Female settlers often had a particularly rough life, working 13 to 14-hour days. The entire settlement idea was premised on the unpaid labor of both women and children. This is the ideal of what these settlements should look like, and these settlers were supposed to be completely self-sufficient, produce all of their own food, and then enough to sell as well, and in the process make Austria as a state more self-sufficient in food production. But the reality was often, pretty stark and depressing. Oh, okay, that's Italy. In Italy, achieving freedom from the global economy was one of Mussolini's goals from the outset. In January 1921, he wrote, "Today we are economically slaves of those who give us coal, slaves of those who give us wheat." And people at the time would have understood he meant the United States. Mussolini's battle for grain began in 1925, partly as a response to the world's closing borders. Achieving autarky became an official goal of the Italian state after the League of Nations imposed economic sanctions on Italy in 1936 in response to the Italian invasion of Abyssinia. In fascist Italy, relentless propaganda instructed Italians, particularly women, on the value of autarky. Weeks were designed to celebrate Italian products such as the Festival of Bread, the Festival of the Grape, and the National Day for Rice. Deglobalization also inspired the invention of synthetic technologies and materials that could replace imported goods. So Kinoto was invented to replace Coca-Cola, and a textile made out of milk products called Lanitol was invented to replace imported cotton. Here's some examples of the propaganda at the time. Don't waste the daily bread. Don't take bread from the sons of our workers, buy only Italian products. This one is, in this store, only Italian products are sold, and this is an autarkic cookbook. Italy had long maintained a global presence through the millions of emigrants that settled in Europe, North, and South America. Emigration had been the dominant solution to the problems of poverty and underemployment that Italy faced. And until the fascist era, the Italian government sought to transform these emigrant communities around the world into a kind of diasporic empire that would substitute for formal colonies. But in the 1920s, thanks to new American restrictions on immigration, Italians could no longer emigrate easily. Mussolini, in any event, wanted to deglobalize Italians by actively preventing emigration and resettling potential migrants internally, repatriating other migrants from abroad and acquiring his own formal empire in Africa. These efforts fed one of the most ambitious internal colonization projects of the interwar period, the reclamation and settlement of the Pontine Marshes. The New York Times described these marshes as, quote, inhabited by only a few fever-racked wretches. For Mussolini, literally draining the swamp became the regime's showcase project. Giuseppe Tassinari, the Undersecretary of State in charge of this project, declared that the Pontine settlements represented, quote, the foundation for the self-sufficiency in food that is the basis of our battle for autarky. At its peak in 1933, close to 125,000 workers were employed on land reclamation projects in the marshes. Many died in abhorrent working conditions. In keeping with the regime's focus on autarky, workers who contracted malaria, which was a lot of them, sometimes were treated with mercury, an ineffective and painful treatment that was used to replace imported quinine. The 5 fascist new towns created in the Agropontino between 1932 and 1938 ultimately housed around 60,000 settlers. Here's some, again, propaganda photos. These settlements might be seen as anti-global cities, as they were meant to embody autarkic, rural, and fascist values, and one of those values was clearly fertility. But as in Austria, the reality was far removed from the propaganda. Administrators constantly complained about the settlers. There were high levels of theft, slowdowns, alcohol abuse, and absenteeism. While Italy was 95% independent in food production by 1939, this was at the cost of increasing food prices and declining nutrition and caloric intake. By the beginning of the Second World War, massive food shortages contributed to the regime's growing unpopularity. Hitler announced his 4-year plan to achieve autarky in 1936. This is a poster for urging people to buy German goods. But anti-internationalism was always part of the Nazi Party platform. In the July 1932 election campaign, Hitler proclaimed, "There's so much international, so much world conscience. There's the League of Nations, the Disarmament Conference, Moscow, the Second International, the Third International." And what did that produce for Germany? The Nazi ideal of blood and soil was formed in opposition to Jewish cosmopolitanism, migration, liberal internationalism, and the global economy. At the first Reich Farmer Day in 1934, Undersecretary of Agriculture Herbert Backe lamented that in previous decades, quote, the relationship between the folk and its territory was blown up by the transnational global economy. Individuals no longer felt bound to the folk to which they belonged by blood, did not feel rooted in their native soil, but instead belonged above all to a global economic community. When the Nazis came to power in Germany and eventually in Austria, they did so on a surge of anti-global rhetoric and activism. But there was ongoing disagreement among leading Nazis about the ideal relationship or the realistic relationship of the Third Reich to the global economy. In 1936, Robert Ley, the leader of the German Workers' Front, mocked Germans who would ostracize a German housewife who, quote, buys a Brazilian coffee or a few Spanish lemons as a traitor to the folk. For Ley, autarky meant backwardness. Cutting ourselves off from the global economy over the long run means not only renouncing conveniences of daily life that are provided by foreign goods, it means renouncing participation in the cultural and technological advancement of the world. The regime conveyed contradictory messages to the German public in the 1930s. On the one hand, German consumers, especially women, were flooded with propaganda, as in Italy, urging them to cook and eat only local foods, boycott chain stores and department stores, which were associated with Jews and globalism, and take up spinning to knit their own textiles. Nazi leaders continued to promote settlement projects and self-sufficiency in food production. Behind the scenes, however, an expert in the Reichsbank confessed, quote, even if we had 20 million sheep, we would only be able to produce 20% of the wool we consume domestically. And the same went for other crucial supplies, for example, rubber, oil. All of these were in short supply even by the end of the Second World War. The solution to this problem was imperial expansion, which was pursued in the name of Großraumwirtschaft, or a large regional economy. After 1939, Nazi policymakers shifted from seeking autarky for the German nation toward achieving autarky for continental Europe, dominated, of course, by Germany, and inspired, once again, by the United States, Japan, and Russia. When fascists went to war in pursuit of more land, they were prepared. Female settlement experts in Nazi Germany became settlement advisors in the occupied East. And years of autarkic propaganda also prepared citizens for wartime shortages and for a do-it-yourself homespun economy. The interwar quest for greater self-sufficiency ultimately justified racist forms of imperial conquest and genocide. But it was never only a far-right fantasy. People also rushed back to the land in democracies. For example, in the United States during the Great Depression, more people moved from city to country than from country to city, reversing a decades-long trend. Since the United States was one of the only countries, or probably the only country in the world that produced enough food to feed its entire population, the goal here was individual rather than national self-sufficiency. A 1933 Wall Street Journal ad urged readers to, quote, buy an abandoned farm and live on trout and applejack until the upturn. During the Great Depression, Henry Ford required his workers in Michigan to cultivate subsistence gardens in order to keep, quote, one foot in industry and another on the land. He was a fierce opponent of the New Deal and saw subsistence farming as an alternative to the dole. By then, his pacifism had morphed into a hatred of all things associated with globalism, including global finance and Jews like Rosica Schwimmer. The Back to the Land movement was also popularized by lifestyle reformers like Ralph Borsodi. This is his book, the original cover on the left and the recently re-released version on the right. I'll talk about that in a second. On his farm in upstate New York, Borsodi, his wife, and 2 children produced almost everything they needed. We weave suitings, blankets, carpets, and draperies. We make some of our own clothing. We do all of our own laundry work. We grind flour, cornmeal, and breakfast cereals. We have our own workshops, including a printing plant, and we have a swimming pool, tennis court, and a billiard room. The family's diet consisted almost entirely of foods they grew themselves, and they shunned pre-digested breakfast foods, white bread, factory-made biscuits and crackers and cakes, polished rice, and white sugar. Borsodi, like Ford, denounced the welfare state, insisting, quote, no social program or government intervention could furnish a cure for the fundamental defect in our present economic system, the excessive dependence of individual men and women for their livelihoods on nationwide and even international economic activities. Ford and Borsodi were staunch opponents of the New Deal, but FDR actually agreed with many of their principles. One New Deal initiative actually resettled tens of thousands of unemployed workers on what were called subsistence homesteads, where they were supposed to grow their own food. Jersey homesteads, this is a kind of publication of the Department of the Interior advertising this program. And then I'm going to show, this is a house from an American settlement. And then I'm going to show you some photos from a settlement called Jersey Homesteads, which moved Jewish textile workers from New York City to rural New Jersey. This is what it looks like today. Thousands of Americans wrote directly to the government eager to participate in these programs. One man explained, the reason I had to leave the farm is that cotton went down to such a low price I could not make it. I could not pay my debts, and I lost all my tools, plows, and stock. In other words, I was cleaned out. I have depended on the CWA for my livelihood for the past 2 years, and I don't like it. Could you please tell me how I could get back on the farm? As in Europe, these back-to-the-land movements were rarely successful on their own terms. In the United States, critics immediately remarked that Borsodi's vision required a huge initial investment in equipment, far beyond the means of most workers. And as public housing advocate Catherine Bauer noted, it also required, quote, a husky wife with a positive taste for domestic production, no desire to do anything else with her time, and a gift for home education. In many settlements, only a minority of the families even made use of their gardens. It didn't pay. They quickly discovered that they could buy vegetables for the same price that they could grow them if they actually accounted for the cost of their labor. Some enjoyed gardening, but as a leisure activity, a symbol of suburban living rather than a means of subsistence. But the fact that these settlement schemes failed does not mean that they were consequential. As it turns out, in the United States, the Great Depression was not the beginning of a permanent return to the land or to farming, but it may have accelerated the shift of populations toward the suburbs. It didn't take much time for the subsistence gardens and poultry sheds envisioned by planners to be transformed into flower gardens and green backyards with swing sets and barbecues. Like I said, here's the Jersey homesteads today. Interwar anti-globalism had many unexpected long-term consequences. Often it produced new and unexpected forms of globalization or internationalism. In the 1930s, for example, companies like the Czechoslovak shoe company Bata and the Ford Motor Company responded to anti-foreigner sentiment and high tariffs by moving production overseas and using local labor. They exported their factories instead of shoes and cars and advertised themselves as local firms. Ford ceded more and more control over his plants to governments and managers abroad, including in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Bata's advertisements in India in the 1930s boasted that Bata shoes were all made in India by Indians, and many Indians still today think that Bata is an Indian company. A few weeks ago, I actually spoke to a Nigerian historian who was also shocked to learn that Bata was not a Nigerian firm. It was the beginning of the multinational corporation as we know it. There were many other lasting consequences of anti-globalism, big and small, positive and negative. New technologies and products were developed in the quest for self-sufficiency, from synthetic fabrics to artificial fertilizers to the synthetic rubber manufactured at Auschwitz. Meanwhile, internationalists did not simply pack up and go home. Experts in organizations like the League of Nations began to develop new initiatives to aid victims of deglobalization, such as minorities and stateless people. Economists in the late 1930s also promoted new ideas which they hoped would spread the benefits of globalization more equally. They set the stage for the construction of the post-war welfare state and for institutions for economic development that aimed after the war to reduce inequality domestically and internationally. As for Rosica Schwimmer, she eventually applied for citizenship in the United States, but her application was denied because she refused to pledge to bear arms in defense of her adopted homeland. She was still a diehard pacifist. She was also a diabetic woman in her 50s, but that had no bearing on her case. Her appeal eventually reached the Supreme Court of the United States, where it was denied. Schwimmer died stateless in 1948. In my talk today, I have attempted to reframe the history of interwar Europe in terms of a history of anti-globalism, and I've inevitably raised some questions about our own moment. This project was inspired by contemporary events. I began my research for it in 2016 in the midst of a refugee crisis, the election of Donald Trump, the British vote for Brexit, and the rise of right-wing populist regimes everywhere. Still, I would not have predicted when I began this research on deglobalization that I would be interrupted by a disruption in global travel and trade on an unprecedented scale. Nor could I have predicted a war in Ukraine that would disrupt global supply chains and bring a new focus on energy independence. During the pandemic in the United States, people reportedly fled cities seeking homes with gardens where they could socially distance. Local foods and homespun goods have never been more popular, thus the republication of Ralph Borsodi's book, as anti-globalism has acquired a new focus on environmental sustainability. As in the interwar era, anti-globalism is resurgent on the left and the right, in democracies and in authoritarian states. It's certainly a good moment to examine the last major era of anti-globalism, to remember the extent to which globalization is simply not unstoppable or inevitable. As a historian, however, I don't see this only or primarily as a story about what the past can teach us about the present. Rather, I have been even more struck by the ways in which the present has reshaped my own understanding of the past. Everything from the effects of the First World War and the Great Depression to the rise of fascism. Between the two world wars, the European continent was rebuilt to insulate and protect people from globalization's perceived and real negative consequences. Those efforts were halted only by the Second World War, after which no one wanted to return to 1918 or 1929. It's still unclear when or how today's campaign against the world will end, but we can certainly we can be certain that our own world will be transformed by it. Thank you. I guess we have some time for questions.
We certainly do.
I know I sort of tried to give you a big overview of the book, which means I covered a lot of different cases and stories, and I'd be really happy to talk in more depth about any particular context that I mentioned, if that would be of interest, as well as about the themes of the book as a whole. Mm-hmm. David.
Yeah,
David?
Thank you, Tara, for a very interesting talk. I was wondering how you put the Soviet Union into your story. There you have an autarkic economy, and in fact, the planned economy that's greatly admired in Germany, United States, other countries. On the other hand, in terms of ideology, you have an explicitly anti-imperial, anti-national country, and you also have the Comintern, the Communist International. Does that all still fit within your story?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I realized early on in writing this book, I feel like as I researched and wrote this book, my ideas went from more simple to more complex. And one of the reasons is because it became very clear that there were a lot of ways. I mean, I mentioned the Gandhi example, but socialism and communism are another one where a drive for economic self-sufficiency was actually very compatible with an ideal of political or internationalism or globalism. The Soviet Union, I feel like every project I do, as people are like, what about Russia? And I still haven't learned Russian, so I can really answer the questions. But the Soviet Union looms over this project in a lot of ways, in the sense that, as you said, in the 1930s, during the Great Depression in particular, people in the West, in the US, in Germany, elsewhere, were looking east and saying, oh, well, they seem to be doing something right, because the Great Depression is not affecting them the way, didn't seem to be affecting them the way it was affecting those other economies. And they attributed that to greater autarky, to greater insulation from the global economy. So the USSR was seen as a model to emulate. In fact, of course, they couldn't see what was going on behind the scenes, that things weren't all so rosy. And also, there's been a really good book by Oscar Sanchez recently that looks at what was actually going on in terms of trade, both in terms of the ideals that the Soviet Union had and the reality, and it was much more complicated than just striving for autarky. But in any event, I think Russia, the Soviet Union, was often seen as a kind of model to emulate. Like the US, it was an empire that could feed itself in theory. What wasn't so obvious was that a lot of people were starving, or that there was a terror going on and people were being shot and so on and so forth. If they knew that, they weren't paying as much attention to it, I guess, in these discussions. So it's a really important part of the story, even though it's not one of the cases that I delved deeply into. I don't know anybody's name, so I'm.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much, Zahra. When I was listening to your talk, I was thinking throughout your presentation about, what appears to be the cyclical nature of globalism, anti-globalism, and deglobalization. And I was very pleased that you actually ended this talk alluding to the contemporary moment, because throughout your talk, I was thinking that, those elites who were longing for the world of yesterday after World War I are in many ways our cosmopolitan elites of today. And of course, the people you're talking about between the wars retreating into autarky or trying, to experiment with other ways of self-sufficiency, in many ways, I'm generalizing, but those are kind of the losers, and even if we stretch it, the deplorables in one sense, right? Or at least sort of this is how it pans out in a big comparative picture, which of course leaves us with this impression that we are now living in this interwar period between the Cold War and then another Cold War coming, right? I mean, there is something to be said about that, which is a scary proposition. And again, I'm not trying to say that we should learn from history so that we know what to do today. But I'm going to go back to history. I just wanted to make this observation because it was inevitable. And when you conclude it, right, this is when we see how this, I mean, hippies retreating on farms to grow organic produce, there is actually something much more macabre about that than just, you know, being hip. Anyways, so what I wanted to ask you is just to give us a little bit more flavor of your book, because what I loved about the book is actually those stories. I mean, your book is full of stories of individuals who are grappling with this moment. And they're trying to figure out how to carve out their place in the world as the world is turning against them, literally, right? And I mean, many of those are sympathetic characters, and many even of those who we might describe as the deplorables are sympathetic characters. So I'm actually wondering whether you can tell us a little bit more. Maybe, I mean, one or two people that have stayed with you during your research, that you can just tell us a little bit more with people grappling with these changes.
Yeah, sure. Although I can't resist taking up the question about
Absolutely.
the present also, probably because other people are thinking about it as well. I have spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I think I'll have to spend a lot more time thinking about it. And I definitely don't have any predictions for the future. I do want to say a few things about some of the differences between today and the period I'm talking about. And one of them is that what happened in the interwar period and the Second World War happened, right? So at the end of the Second World War, I alluded to this very briefly, you know, people came together, economists and policymakers came together at Bretton Woods, and they created institutions and that were supposed to prevent the global economy from going bust in the same way again. And in many ways, that arrangement also broke down. But to some extent, there's still a lot of ideas that remain with us from that period, whether it's kind of ideals of economic development, however poorly or misguidedly they've been implemented, the kind of ideal of full employment and of welfare states, which of course again has been deconstructed to a large extent in many contexts, but still there are, I think, some institutions and safeguards in place that I think make a difference ultimately. That we're not living in 1929. There are also, I think, some real differences in the anti-globalism of today and yesterday. So, for example, the focus on the environment is really an important one. It's not something you see any consciousness of in the 30s. I mean, sometimes these movements would have had what we would think of as environmentalist effects at the time, but nobody was talking about them in those terms. And then the other issue, and this is something Quinn Slobodian has written about very well, is that deglobalization, to the extent to which it's happened in the present, has been very selective. So there's been a lot of movement against migration and to some extent against trade, but capital has continued to flow pretty liberally, right? So I do think it's important not just to sort of say, hey, it's like the interwar period all over again, but to think about differences, and there are probably many more that I'm not mentioning or thinking about right now. Yet I still would say that what's remarkable to me is the extent to which, like, looking back, I have come to see this period of the 20s and 30s in a different way because of today's events. And then in terms of individuals, yeah, I really wanted to kind of fill this book with characters. And Rosica Schwimmer is one who I talked about. Henry Ford features in the book. But I'll mention a couple people, at least one or two, who I didn't talk about as much today, who I found fascinating. One is Thomas Bata. He was the founder of the Bata shoe company in Czechoslovakia. It was founded before the First World War in what was then the Habsburg Empire. He was dubbed the shoe king, or the Henry Ford of Europe. And he really, I mean, he was not a super sympathetic character in a lot of ways. He was like really racist. He was like the Elon Musk of his time. He was like a pilot. He actually died in a plane crash piloting his own plane. after he insisted on taking off in bad weather in spite of, the advice of his co-pilots. But, he had this insight to this kind of counterintuitive insight to lean into globalization when everybody else was leaning out. So again, instead of retreating, he basically said, okay, we're going to make the shoes everywhere else in the world. And, that strategy was immensely successful. So, and he's just a fascinating individual and character that I get into. I guess he's more of a globalist than an anti-globalist, but the way he also appropriated the rhetoric of anti-globalism in promoting globalization is also fascinating. Like, he literally went around claiming to be a local firm, and people still have that impression today, which is extraordinary. I'm trying to think in terms of some of the sympathetic anti-globalists. I think the sort of link between anti-globalism and anti-colonial nationalism is something we have to take really seriously. And I think also there's just a lot of ordinary people who are not really famous people in the book who did want to go back to the land and become self-sufficient, or who saw this as a kind of liberatory project. And so I try and kind of highlight their voices, I would say. The other thing I tried really hard to do with this book is kind of bring women into the history of globalization. Sort of responding, Lynn Hunt wrote a really, I found it powerful anyway, kind of critique of the new global history. This is an old critique now, but kind of there's been a big turn toward the history of capitalism and global history more broadly, and kind of what happens to women when we zoom out to that macro level. Sometimes they get lost. So I ended up writing a lot about women, both as characters in the book, but also about the ways in which anti-globalism was based on a particular set of ideals of gender, which often meant rerouting women in the home and the land, and kind of the discussion of how much housework these projects required, to make all your own clothes and grow all your own food. It was quite explicit that you actually needed to have a woman, a wife, and often children to enlist as unpaid workers in this project. So I don't know if that's a little bit of a taste.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk. I have a question about what's the concept of the global that your anti-globalists are reacting to, and also about the role of the diaspora in that. Your comment about how Mussolini was trying to sort of deglobalize Italy and Italians and sort of break apart older immigrant networks made me think a lot about how after 1947, Nehru does the same thing to the Indian diaspora. And then it's in the 90s with economic liberalization that sort of the Indian diaspora is brought back in, and then Hindu nationalism is really fueled through those diaspora networks. And sort of kind of the relationship between the place of the diaspora with the nation within imperial structures, and how those are kind of rapidly shifting during the interwar era.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question. I would say more broadly that there are a lot of there are almost as many different conceptions of the global as there are anti-globalism. But I think that this issue about diaspora is particularly interesting, and it kind of, I would say this is in some ways the link between my previous book and this one, is that I started thinking when I was writing about emigration and the ways in which East European societies in particular were thinking and talking about it between the wars, that in many ways already anxiety about emigration was very tied to anxieties about globalization, that these fears that our migrants are not going to be, a substitute for empire and a source of great glory, but that they're going to be treated like non-white people, like slaves or coolies, and that therefore, we need to bring them home, basically, or prevent them from leaving. And that's a really powerful kind of idea in Eastern Europe and also in Italy, and I imagine also in other contexts in which, you know, there are diasporas forming in this period. So I think that it's really, there's a real shift in thinking about emigration that intensifies between the wars. It's already there in the late 19th century, but it becomes a more like legal preoccupation and a subject for policy in the 1930s. And, you know, I think it's both ideological and pragmatic in the sense that when borders do close, you kind of are forced to deal with this question of what to do with the surplus population that was previously emigrating. And that's really explicit in Italy, but I think it's also explicit to some extent in Poland and other places that had had large